Philosophers have been debating what wisdom means for centuries. Do you have a working definition?
I do. That's a good thing, since you picked on me first. So I think of wisdom as, I tend to think of all the virtues as fairly complex states, so none of them is going to have a really small definition, so be prepared. But I think of wisdom as the set of dispositions and skills and policies that help us deliberate about what matters in life and then translate that into choices and action. So we can figure out what's good and then achieve those things in our lives, and also, help other people do so too if they're struggling with their deliberating and choices.
Now, Lisa, you come at this from more of a science perspective. Do you have a definition of wisdom?
I think it's very similar to Valerie's in some ways. I mean, what I would say is wisdom isn't one thing. It's not one way of living or one way of applying knowledge. Sometimes wisdom is realizing what you don't know and stepping back from your sense of certainty that you do know. And sometimes wisdom is being very clear about what your goals or values are and using what you know to achieve them. So, one of the basic dilemmas we all face, because we're a very social species, and that's one of our greatest adaptive advantages actually as a species, is that we rely on each other and we depend on each other, but we have this kind of basic dilemma of when do we favor getting along versus when do we favor getting ahead. There are many ways to talk about that, but wisdom is in part knowing which one you're favoring in the moment and achieving it effectively, I would say.
Well, Philip, let me turn to you. If we try to put this in some historical perspective, I mean, wisdom has been discussed and debated for centuries. I mean, going back to Aristotle at least. Has the meaning of it changed over the centuries? I mean, as philosophers have debated, and more recent philosophers, and David Hume, Ralph Waldo Emerson, does wisdom mean something different now?
I think wisdom meant something very different for Emerson than what it meant for Aristotle, for example. But I actually wanted to preface this by saying that, unlike you, Steve, I am not wise. And
I'm not wise either.
And one of the things I'm not wise about is wisdom itself. And so I back away from any attempt to think that there's a clear definition here. I think we can sometimes say of people that they're wise about particular things, even though they're quite foolish about others. And that's different from saying that they know those things. To be wise about something or in a particular area seems to have an overall sense of how that area fits together. There's a kind of wholeness about wisdom that there isn't about scattered pieces of knowledge. That's the way I think about it. And when I use wise, period, it tends to be related to life. And I think many of the things that Lisa and Valerie said are absolutely spot on here, being able to make sense of your life. But it seems to me that right at the core of this is somehow knowing who you are and being able to make decisions in ways that realize what you take to be yourself and what's valuable in that self. And
so to put this in some historical perspective, you said, to take two examples, Aristotle had a very different view of wisdom than Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Yes.
How?
Well, Aristotle seems to be much more serious, and Emerson celebrates whimsy. He celebrates kicking over the traces. He celebrates a certain kind of individuality that I think would have horrified Aristotle, actually. So, I mean, they're very, very different. It seems to me that both Lisa and Valerie are aiming at a much more encompassing sense of wisdom, which allows for different kinds of characters and different kinds of people to be wise in rather different ways. And that's what makes me a little bit more hesitant to try to frame a clear, precise, unambiguous definition here.
Yeah, Lisa?
I would actually go a little bit further even and say even how a person is wise varies tremendously from context to context. So oftentimes when we use these words that refer to a mental state or a character, we assume a character trait or characteristic. We assume that there's unity or elemental nature. What these words actually usually refer to entire populations of instances. So, for example, happiness is not one thing. It actually is highly variable. What it feels like, what your body is doing, what your face is doing, what your voice sounds like, it's highly variable from instance to instance in a very situated way, meaning that basically your brain is trying to optimize for the given situation that you're in. So not only are different people wise in different ways, but you yourself are not an entity. You have a lot of flexibility in what you know, how you use what you know, and coming to grips with that, I think actually is important in realizing a meaningful life.